In this section we're going to name amines, and we can find that there are essentially two functional class names for this. We can call them alkyl amines or alkanamines, and we will see examples of those shortly. The next thing we need to do is to help us with the naming is to determine whether they are primary, secondary, tertiary, or quaternary amines. So if we go through the following molecules, we can see that there's still a lone pair on each of these nitrogens except the last one. And we go through and we find that there's one carbon attached to this nitrogen. This is a primary amine. There's two carbons attached to this one. This is a secondary amine. This is a tertiary amine. And this is a quaternary amine. And another thing to note with a quaternary amine, if we go through the formal charge, we will find that there's always a permanent positive charge on a quaternary amine. So the primary amines have only one alkyl group attached to the nitrogen, and the root name is based on the longest chain name with the NH2 attached to it. So if we find the longest carbon chain, we have 1, 2, 3 carbons. This is a propane, so we can simply call this a propanamine. We can also call this aminopropane. And we can also call this propylamine. So for naming the following molecule, the tendency would be to, and the easy way out would be to call this by the 1, 2, 3, 4, butane. And in the 2 position is an amino, but the amino only applies if the other substituents have priority, and in this case there's no substituents that have priority. So we actually want to have the amine as part of the name, of the main name itself. So we want amine to be part of the last name, and that means essentially that this has become the substituent group. So in the 2 position is the butyl. So we can call this a 2-butylamine. Another name would be the sec-butylamine. It's a little more common name because we're naming this functional group as opposed to the 2-butyl. And the final way of naming it would be calling it it's a butane, but the amine is in the 2 position. So butanamine, so butan 2-amine. So the first one refers to the alkyl amine naming, like we had talked about, and the second one refers to the alkanamine naming that we had talked about. For secondary amines, we have 2 alkyl groups attached to the nitrogen. So we can see with this molecule we have the 2 alkyl groups attached. The root name is based on the longest chain with the NH attached to it, and so in this case we have a single carbon on this side and 2 carbons, an ethyl group on this side. So the root name is going to be ethylamine, and we need to indicate that the methyl is attached to it as well, and it is attached to the N. So we're going to call this an N with a capital N. This is an N-methyl ethylamine. So the N-methyl meaning that the methyl group is attached to the nitrogen, and the ethylamine is the other hydrocarbon attached to the nitrogen. So that's the alkyl naming. If we wanted to do the alkanamine naming, this would simply be ethanamine is the final name. So we have an N-methyl ethanamine. Usually the alkylamine is the preferred way of naming these. And finally, the tertiary amines. These have 3 alkyl groups attached to it. And again, the root name is based on the longest chain attached to the nitrogen. So if you have 3 different alkyl groups, the one with the longest chain becomes the base name, and the other 2 are referred to the nitrogen on the longest carbon base chain. So we have a couple of ways of naming this. Our base chain name is methylamine. we have another methyl group and another methyl group attached, two of them. We have to denote that each of them is attached to a nitrogen. So we have one nitrogen, so we have an N-methyl. We have another N-methyl. Since there's two methyls attached, this is a dimethyl methylamine. And of course, if we want to call it a methanamine, this is an NN dimethyl methanamine. However, the easy way of naming this is just saying it's a trimethylamine, indicating that there are three methyl groups attached to the nitrogen. This is a more of a common name, but you'll find this used more often in industry. So let's try naming the following molecules. We have a primary amine on this side, so we can call this simply an ethylamine. Sorry, I was about to call it a propyl. So we can call this ethanamine. Or ethylamine. If we move on to the second one, we can call this, this is an ethanamine as well. Ethanamine. However, in the end position we have another ethyl group. So this is an N-ethyl ethanamine. This is also an N-ethyl ethylamine. And in industry, you'll just typically see this called diethylamine. And the assumption then is that the last substituent is a hydrogen involved in this. We move on to the last one. We have two ethyl groups and a methyl group attached to the tertiary nitrogen. So for naming, I'm going to make some space. So the base name is, again, ethanamine, because it's one of the longest carbon chains. And what I'll do is I'll write up here, in one position is an N-ethyl, in another position is an N-methyl. So if we were to go through this alphabetically, I would call this an N-ethyl, N-methyl, ethanamine. Or the N-ethyl, I won't rewrite this, but the N-ethyl ethylamine instead of the ethanamine. So the other way of naming is N-ethyl, N-methyl ethylamine. If the amine is part of a chain where there is a higher priority functional group, for example a carboxylic acid, the amine group gets named as a prefix and it's an amino. So we can even take an alcohol as an example, which is higher priority than the amine. We look at the longest carbon chain, 1, 2, 3. This is a propyl group. Since the alcohol is higher priority, this is going to be a propanol. The alcohol is in the 1 position, and the amine then is on the 1, 2, 3. And we call this then the 3-amino 1-propanol.